Thank you. The last time Keisha and I were together in Freeport, she said that she didn't think that young Bahamians were conceptually separated from the water. And I had to replay that in my mind because democratically, there should be access to the coast. That access to the coast has since then decreased markedly. So we are losing our cultural awareness of how to be in the space. So thank you. My apologies. I am realizing I am not good at multitasking and doing everything that we are supposed to do in this new post-neoliberal world. Because without rights, we have very few privileges. So as I sit to write this, the lights have gone off 3 times and a 4th is coming. The fan surges noisily until the sound dies to a quiet, low, slow groan. The lights flicker, then dip. The fan revives its vigor. The lamps regain their luster. Then zap, the computer screen goes black. The battery backup power beeps wildly and then stops. It has worn itself out since this week started. BPL is not responsible. Solar is not responsible. Government did not do whatever. The MP knows nothing and says so. MPs fix it all. What could take me a week takes me a month. What could take me an hour takes me a day. What could take me a minute does not happen. So democracy without place. Do we have places for democracy to be? And thank you all for being here. I'm sorry if I bore you to death. If I do, just throw something at me. So what we have on the screen is I've tried to decontextualize photos a bit because I don't want to criminalize the spaces that are challenged by their lack of democratic representation. And that's not democratic representation as in voting, but democratic representation as in the fact that they all send money to the general fund and that money disappears into a black hole that will come up again in the presentation later. So this is a part of the Bahamas after Dorian. This is 5 years after Dorian, I think. And you can see where people have managed to cobble together and where people have, or where government, where the state has not done anything. So in my research on Dorian, I've been looking at how Dorian's impact is felt unevenly across the communities. And the community that has felt it most impactfully is Bahamian. Usually across the board for the Bahamian community, the second homeowners have had far better luck, if luck could be the right word, with the Dorian recovery. And there's a reason for that. Laws in the colonial context. So there is a paper that I started to work on a few months ago, and I realized as I was writing it yesterday, I was not going to be able to discuss it because it was too long. So laws in the colonial context is voice and voicelessness in the democratic franchise in the colony, ergo post-colony. Land equals votes. And I'm not sure why we often talk about democracy in the Bahamas when there was no democracy for most Bahamians until the 1960s, when there was some degree of franchisement or enfranchisement as opposed to disenfranchisement. When we had the Company Act, the company could vote as many times as it had buildings or owned property, and that the company owners were usually not non-white Bahamians. They were often very colonial subjects or colonial citizens who were resident in the Bahama Islands. And I use the Bahama Islands as a signifier for a distinction between the Bahamas and the Bahama Islands, and the new incantation, the islands of the Bahamas, because they're very different places. So the color and race, votelessness. Until the 1960s, most people could not vote. So where we are coming to, again, is unequal citizenship. And that was never, ever displaced by an enactment that supposedly made citizenship equal after, what do we call it? No, before independence. Majority rule, because suddenly everybody was ruling. So the concept of majority rule was, or is, kind of troublesome when the coloniality of the post-colony means that racism without racists is alive and well, and powerlessness with the powerful continues to be the matter of the day. So I want you to consider that land equals votes, because that comes up again in the 21st century, particularly since, I guess, 2015, 2020. I'm not sure when it really became a huge step in the government's arsenal to get votes again back in. So again, this is another part of the post-Dorian recovery. The post office, like the post office in New Providence that I focus on in the paper itself, has met its demise. And by moving the post office out of the public space or out of the commons, you are democratically saying that democracy does not need a post office. The people do not need a free and sovereign space to use to create communication or to save money, which is one of the things that the post office did for a long time. I think it has started to do that again, but the lack of access to a post office is as problematic as saying, well, we do not have access to the vote. So this is local spaces or global places. And in the shot, what I'm trying to show is that these are local spaces, but they're actually global places because there are very few locals left in these spaces. What we have is the globalization of the Bahamian geopolitical space through intentional processes that are delimiting what would conceptually be called citizenship under the democratic franchise. But I can't say that because citizenship itself is so problematic in this economic context. So the boats in the background are actually large and lovely, and the boats in the foreground that we can't see are locally owned and quite small and very different. So democracy needs space for food, healthcare, welfare, learning, community, land, sea, air, water, power. Food, what does that look like? Do we have democratically run food spaces? Olivia's looking very perplexed. Now we know that food, as my recent work looks at, is actually not democratic in the Bahamas. It is run by a system of familial networks that tend to be very tightly owned and governed and operated. And the government has no say, for the most part, in how those networks function. So we go from the importers to the wholesalers to the retailers down to some of the mom and pop shops. How is that democratic when there is no transparency in who actually owns the ability to import, distribute, and sell food? So the idea of food sovereignty is really becoming even more problematic because as the owners of those spaces decrease in number, the need for food increases. And healthcare, well, I think Dorian really showed us what healthcare was like on Abaco. I mean, because of the work we did in Abaco, it was very much about getting the stories from people who were there. And that was really challenging. Welfare. What is that? What is welfare when the government can say after Dorian that, well, you did not pay your insurance premiums, so you deserve to lose your house? Or you are retired, but your insurance premiums are 3 times your income, and your income is based on what your retirement brings you. So do we eat or do we pay insurance premiums? Learning, that's a whole different one. Community. I used this example in the Research Edge the other day. Most communities on our islands are starting to die. Not because it's a design intention, but because so many spaces are very slowly becoming commercialized. The commercial presence changes the demographic of the neighborhood, and the neighborhood then loses people just as they get older, but also as one business moves in, another business moves in. Those businesses then displace the living spaces of people, and they vote differently if they do vote. And so at night, when those businesses are closed, the level of dysfunction in the community increases. So what happens is you get decay throughout the community because there are no longer living bodies going into these spaces. So the land, again, the land has been annexed. The sea is being annexed by the private islanders in Exuma. That Keisha didn't believe me when I said, suddenly the low tide mark was where their private property sign went into effect. And they literally policed that. The air, we know that the problems with the air, the water, most of the water on our islands is now private. It is facilitated by government, but it is owned by private entities that deliver it to the communities from time to time. If you're on Ragged, it's a small company that gives water to the settlement. If you are on Eleuthera, there are multiple companies, supposedly, that provide water when it's not off. So power, much like water, has become a very expensive private commodity, even though most Bahamians don't think of it as a private commodity. We think of it as a public good, like water. So all of these utilities have been moved back into the private hand, really limiting the democratic process. So the theoretical underpinnings, colonial democracy equals law and disorder, according to Komarov and Komarov. The predicament of post-colonies arises from their place in a world order dominated by new modes of governance, new sorts of empire, new species of wealth, an order that criminalizes poverty and race and entraps the South in relations of corruption. So what we get from Komarov and Komarov is where the government always talks about the level of corruption in the communities, the gangs, everything that's going on, as a problem that is caused by those people, has nothing to do with us people. So that distancing is huge, and it's also based around race. It's based around race, sex, gender, and the way all of those are constructed. And within race, it is based on hierarchical understandings of colorism, which then goes way back to the colonial period of being closer to whiteness is desirable. So legal lawlessness, Elkins 2022, is really important because it shows how the law is used to break the law. to disenfranchise people constantly and to make sure that the rights that they thought they had, they don't actually have, because they are written in a way that moves the rights into a different sphere. So you can create an emergency and suspend the right to anything and then go back and backdate that emergency so that those people cannot access redress for any problems that happened before the emergency was created. All right. Komarov and Komarov argue, but there is another side to all this. In the post-colonies, many display endemic disorder, but they also so often fetishize the law, its ways and means in probing the coincidence of disorder and legality. This essay suggests that post-colonies foreshadow a global future under construction. I think we have reached that global future. I think that the suspension of democratic process in a lot of places, the suspension of the right to own space for the sovereign state by the multinationals, it shows us that things have moved in a different direction that we thought they were going a few years ago. And one of the texts that I think really is helpful in some ways is Racism Without Racists, Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racial Inequality in America. And that's by Bonilla Silva, who is a Puerto Rican professor at Duke. And then Spatial Injustice by Edward Soja. And looking at the ways space and access, or the right to the city, by David Harvey and Seth Lowe. So one of the things I want to bring up that we often ignore, and Lowe does a really good job of looking at spatializing culture, and On the Plaza, two works that she did in early 2000s and one in 2016, is how public squares, or Rawson Square, Parliament Square, are redesigned to get rid of the public. So the way they're designed, or they were designed before, you could sit down. There were services that Bahamians could access, problematically, of course, because Bay Street was a contested space between white merchants and black Bahamians. But there was still some access by the end of the 70s. Coming into the 80s, there was a great deal of access. By the 2000s, Bay Street had died. And when they redesigned Rawson Square, they actually took out all the seating. When they dismantled the Churchill building, they removed all the public democratic space from the tourist zone. But that was by design. That was not a mistake. We chose to think of it as them opening the space to improve the tourist product, but not the Bahamian product. Because it's no longer a Bahamian space, it is a global space in the Bahamas. Okay, so if you have questions, just shoot them at me. I am happy to engage as we go. So spatial injustice in education, food, and health. What we don't see is the fact that most communities, even within New Providence, do not have access to fresh food, do not have access to fresh fruit and vegetables in any real way or sustainable way. If I go to East Street, the Super Value on East Street, or the Super Value on Nassau Street, the produce they get or they sell is very different from the produce I get on top of the hill, Mackey Street, or even Winton, or especially Cable Beach. If I then go to Whole Foods, that's a whole different market. All right. What we are accustomed to and what we learn to ignore. So these are things we have learned to ignore because of the way the space has been designed to exclude us, but include us in our own exclusion. which is a part of the democratic process. And again, goes back to racism without racists, because we're not racist. But there is incredible racism within the colonial project in the post-colony. So that is something that we've learned to ignore. And Soja talks about the unequal access to provide for oneself, to live on land that is safe, that is not toxically, or is not toxic, it's not radiated. We tend not to look at the history of bases in the Bahamas where the radiation has resided, or look at the demographics and the clusters, the disease clusters where cancer has really proliferated in the different islands, or why on Grand Bahama in this particular settlement there is more cancer than, say, in another settlement further away from X place. I'm not going to call any names. I think everybody kind of has an idea. Or on Eleuthera, why Governor's Harbor and the downrange, from that downrange base, has so much more breast cancer in the community. But we don't discuss that. That's a huge part of the health demographic in the Bahamian community. And yes, the BRCA gene is also problematic within that context, but it is not the cause of the problem. So the place of or for schools, and schools power communities. And this is something that we see in Ragged Island when they closed the school. Well, Irma closed the school. Everybody left because the kids needed to go to school. Schools create thinkers and an educated population, and that is a problem on most of our islands and in all our communities, because the disparities between schools is massive, especially when you are a thinking parent. I didn't say right thinking, I just said thinking. So the classrooms are places to build complete humans. It is not a place to train academically. It is a place to get people to be. It is a place to get people to think, to act, to engage. It is a place to build communities outside or within the community. And the colonial legacy of classroom violence is huge in our society, even though most people won't discuss it, except for Dawn, who loves having been a student of QC. The case of Puerto Rico, I can say that QC was pretty exceptionally brutal, especially to young men. The case of Puerto Rico, we will be creating a system of charter schools and vouchers. So after Irma and then Maria came, Rosselló came on, Ricky Rosselló came on and said, we will be creating a system of charter schools. We are dismantling the Department of Education in Puerto Rico, and we will create a different system so that everybody can decide where they go to school. Mind you, this had predated Maria. Most communities in the mountains of Puerto Rico were being told they had to go an hour and a half outside of their community to go to school. But there was no direct access. You had to go all the way around and come back into the mountain. And I use Puerto Rico as an example because I know everybody gets upset when we use Bahamian examples. The case of Ragged Island, I think there are now 3 students in the school on Ragged Island because it took so long for the school to rebuild after Irma. The case of Abaco, well, unfortunately, Dorian and COVID dovetailed, and I think we were without school in some parts of Abaco for 2.5 to 3 years. So in that time, the learning loss was massive, but also the community loss was huge because people who could afford to move left, and people who could not afford to move stayed. But people who used to go to private schools were then forced to go to state school. And when we look at schools, that's a big problem. The case of East End, Grand Bahama, Don was with me when we did our photographic trip. Yes, I'm implicating Don in the process. When we went to East End and looked at how the schools had fallen apart under the weight of the storm. So, new currents in democratic development in the post-colony. Law-bound investment paves the way to citizenship without borders. And I hope you understand what that means. So this is what the new development looks like. This is not about local settlements. And so I wanted to go back to the earlier Settlements Act, the Act of Settlement, which was the initial settlement violence that colonized the post-colony or the colony and made it so that there was nothing before the English came. The Act of Settlement is really an important act within the laws of colonialism because it says very violently that nothing existed. We are everything. We name everything. We create everything. And as I said, the Companies Act and then the Development Acts that comes. So the Development Acts and the Company Acts work together because like the East India Company, they all develop the sacando, the rape and pillage of the community for an incorporation. So government agencies and authorities as well as the PPPs are really important, all right? Because the ways that these authorities are incorporated speaks to who is involved and who is not involved. And then the ways that the PPPs are created speaks to who actually has access and who doesn't have access. And then we fall into the 1990s or the 1980s trade liberalization and the liberalization acts that we then create. And the Global Policies Act and at local levels, and the Immovable Properties Act and the International Persons Land Holding Act of 1993. I think that everybody thinks that it's just a pretty much, innocuous piece of legislation, but something that we have to begin to consider when you look at the democratic process is there is no innocuous legislation. It is all very pointedly used in particular ways to get an effect or to achieve an effect. So the International Persons Act repealed the Immovable Property Act that only came into effect in 1981. So again, when we think about democratic process and democratic enfranchisement, we tend to have a very wide understanding, but not understand that there's a very small window when it was actually very effective. And yes, I know that if you were black and you had slaves or you had enslaved Africans, you could own land. And I know that there were people that did that, but it doesn't negate the fact that there are challenges that we are taught to ignore here. The financialization since 2007, 2008 and beyond. Local empowerment. Do local acts actually empower locals to citizenship? Anybody gonna come on, nibble? Nothing? The growth of the global unreal. So Saskia Sassang talks about the financialization of the markets as a process of making unreal what used to be real. So money is no longer real. Money is no longer fixed. It is all hyper fictitious. It is all hyper debted. There is no real money for the most part. We work in real money, But most of the people who now own a lot of the Bahamas do not function in real money. They function in anybody? Well, Bitcoin, but Bitcoin, not even Bitcoin. Financial transactions that don't have any real place. There is no reality to the numbers that they're playing with. Yes, we live within those numbers, but we are not a part of that hyper monetization of money. So these things are no longer real. They don't equate money and wealth. The hyper financialization of the market means that one family can buy 10 condos in New Providence in the new Goldwyn section without ever having come here to see them and leverage themselves to the hilt, but never actually run out of money. Until, like the I group, there is a reckoning that happens because none of it was real, and the government is left to hold the bag of CH1T. So the hyper wealth that has been created, particularly since 2007 meltdown, has allowed this new Bahamas to be created. So what Kalmaroff and Komarov were talking about has already happened. We just are behind in the way we look at it, because we're still thinking that, oh, we can buy a piece of land, we can go, the minister can go and create new legislation that will manage the rental market, as the government announced, 2 weeks ago on the TV and radio. But whose market are they managing? Are they managing our market? Or are they managing the external market that looks at Airbnbs that are usually owned by companies, or one person will own 5 to 10 Airbnbs within one community, so it becomes a company? We don't see that because they haven't shown us that. So that is where your space goes. But again, because there is no land registry by design, the registry that is for land is for a particular kind of land. And that's where the Immovable Properties Act, being repealed by the International Persons Landholding Act, was really troublesome, because it had managed a particular kind of transaction to stay outside of the Hotels Encouragement Act, the Out Island Development Encouragement Act, which pushes for international investors to come in. The Immovable Properties Act tried to maintain or retain space for Bahamians, but that space had already been occupied by the colonial deals that we didn't know anything about. So going back 20 years, very quickly, world trade economics and offshoring of labor, land, and services. Sound familiar? Very easy. WTO did that, and we agreed we started in the early 2000s. So when I was in Washington at the OAS, it was a big part of what we were talking about. So now everybody's like, well, thankfully we didn't sign on to the WTO. We signed on to the Caribbean Single Market and Economics, because the idea was that that would help us combat being absorbed by the WTO. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or the Act, is all pretty much in place, but through different avenues. The Lome and the Cotonou, that really did help us until they ended in absolute terms in 2006, I think it was, 2007, when Bacardi left. I think that was the last vestige of those benefits. We don't think of that. Oh, Bacardi left. Okay, why did Bacardi leave? Yeah, there were other things. There was a lawsuit. There was some dumping, supposedly. Then the EU CARIFORUM Economic Partnership Agreement that I was kind of involved in, which was meant to make us stronger to go into the WTO as a bloc. That happened, but then everybody splintered when it came to the WTO. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the General Agreement on Trade and Services, we don't even need to sign those because we already signed on to the EPA. And the EPA is WTO plus. So it's all been done. Everything's gone. You can't bolt the gate after everything's out. So some people need less. So this is why justifying school closures. So what we're going to see in the next few years in the inner city is schools closing, because the inner city communities are slowly eroding, because the people that live there don't live there. The people who live there rent. The people who they rent from are using the revitalization project to leverage themselves out of slum rental into company building. So community shift and loss, Commercialization Act, and the revitalization program. So we go right back to Orlando Patterson and slavery and social death. And then you have silly things like that are meant to protect us, called the evacuation orders and the power of the executive. When Ragged Islanders were told they needed to leave, but they were not necessarily given where to go or how to get there. And then the government said, oh, we will protect you. We will take you and lead you. I'm not going to say where we're going to lead you, but we're going to lead you. We'll keep you safe for a while. But then once you're out, you're not allowed to go back because it is now uninhabitable. I think it's still uninhabitable, but because I don't think that designation has been removed. But in order to find that out, I would need to ask questions, and to ask questions is to commit a mortal sin. This is what democracy looks like. So the emergency orders, as law and disorder, or Elkin's legal lawlessness says, suspends people's rights. And it causes other kinds of challenges that, as we see from Komarov and racism without racists, is it criminalizes the poor, the working class, and people who tend to be of darker complexion. So what I find interesting is the way Bad Bunny uses all of this in his music and the music videos, and how there was a story in Rolling Stone in 2022 when Aquí Vive Gente and El Apagón, so the blackout, came out, and by Juan Arroyo. And he says the documentary dedicates time to the maligned sweetheart deal that the previous administration of former Governor Wanda Vasquez made with a private company called Luma Energy, the current administrator of Puerto Rico's power grid. Bueno, I'm not going to say anything about the Bahamian administrator of the power grid, because then I would definitely be looking for trouble. So Juan Arroyo makes some really interesting points. So power in the islands has become less stable, less affordable, and less easily accessible since it was democratized way back when. So yesterday, today, and the day before, and the day before that, and the day before that, and the day before that, the power was off. But that's only Eleuthera. But they can afford that because the people that count have generators. So when we consider what the democratic process looks like, the banks retreat into a safe area on a phone where we can technically challenge, be, and reach them without touching them for democracy space is unneeded, unnecessary, overrated. Banks are not needed in island democracy because holes are everywhere. Potholes, farming holes, blue holes. Take your pick. Just don't use the black hole because it will take the wealth from your hands and trade it with the enemy you cannot see. As we boast about water in Exuma, rushing into homes like never before, banks retreat into safe spaces. Residents call numbers from prepaid cell phones without minutes. Your call has been disconnected. Please try your call again. Put credit on your phone. Like the lights over a dark and decaying local Puerto Rico. No, not really. I love Luma. They keep my lights shining in the darkness of the blackout, like the Dominican night that plunges everything, including the music, into silence, and then it winds up again and goes forward. The colonial world is a world cut in two. And this is where I love Fanon in the 1960s, because he speaks to everything we are experiencing in 2025. The settler colony. The first time I saw a bank with lights on and windows glistening, I was struck. What was this? The night sky punctuated by street lamps that thoroughly blinked in the powerful darkness of rising and falling electricity. Waves, electrical waves like Santo Domingo in the plunge, that plunged music into slurred spaces and then dead silence, only to beat back, louder as the power surges on. The boutique bank was beautiful. Chairs looking like a front room welcomed one and all. The native quarter. This is what the native quarter looks like. See any difference between that? Oh, and by the way, this place is where we can buy it off the internet without coming here. Okay? This is not the place you can buy off the internet without coming here. This is a place that has been leveraged by the storm and cannot afford to rebuild. And this is what the native schools look like. I refuse to take a picture of the new private schools because I think that would be really problematic. Why think differently in the space of democracy? But this is Brazil. And if you know anything about Brazil, one and all is not, are not, no es, welcome. Not true of the Bahamas. One and all, come in. The bank was beautiful, light and rich looking, inviting. That was when the world changed, only I did not know it then. I was confounded by the look and the fiction of welcome. This is Brazil. And if you know anything about Brazil, welcome is not open. Banks are not open. If you look like this, please do not bother the good people who will access our services and be able to use them. Changing climates and slow violence in play. So this is climate change that removes the democratic process even more from the way land is developed. And all of this is very local, so I'm sure people recognize this. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much. Yes, Far. Just don't fire too hard.
Hold it down. You come on. You hold it for a while.
In your land acts, I think you missed out a very important one.
Yes,
the Land Act. No, the Quieting Titles Act. But I think more importantly, because it's more recent, is the Land Acquisition Act, which gave us Albany
Yes.
And
gave us FTX, I'm sure.
public purpose, any purpose for which land is, in the opinion of the Governor General, required for providing hotel accommodation or promoting the tourist traffic of the Bahamas, or providing increased harbor and dock facilities, or the agricultural development of the Bahamas, or any other public undertaking. So the government acquired the land and sold it to Albany.
But I think that act came into being after they had already tried to move people off the land, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I think there was some legal wranglings prior, but this came into effect in 2008.
Yeah, because they were pushing people off the Albany land in 2005, I think that.
But you see, there's a level of consistency with us because Grand Bahama is, I think, really the prime example of us displacing.
And I did not go into the whole Freetown discussion because Grand Bahama is such a problematic example because Freetown was moved how many times?
Who knows?
And reestablished, but according to the power holders, with the consent of the locals.
Always.
Yeah. The Land Acquisition Act, yes. But that's why Law and Disorder in the Post-Colony is such an important work in the Bahamas, because as Stephen Arana says, there was no one law that says we were segregated. And of course there was no one law, but the operation of all the laws together shows how segregated we really are, especially the operation of the new borderless economic citizenship laws, or whatever they are, because I haven't seen that law yet. That
You become a permanent resident.
right.
One of the things that help us along the way is our lack of efficiency. And so people take a while before they actually get the documentation, etc. And we frustrate a lot of people. So we don't have the level of displacement we might have had had we been a lot more efficient.
Yeah, and that was when the FNM came into power last time, and they created the Commercial Enterprises Act, the bill that became the act that pushed through people's work permits if immigration did not respond to them within 2 weeks, I think it was, and making them come into the country without the need for a permit if they could show that they had not been processed in time. But then again, that goes right to the GATS and the offshoring of services through the onshoring of local, because you can no longer talk about non-locals when it comes to availing people services. So non-locals have the same access to local spaces as locals do, especially under WTO regulations.
Tony, I think the transnational version of not having any laws of segregation is the global unreal you're talking about. Interestingly, you can see that across the world, right? And we are seeing a lot of backlash against them in countries like Japan and Spain and Ireland, and especially in very sort of localized way where the locals are protesting against multinational in terms of Airbnb.
Yeah.
And they're talking about space, and they're talking about high rents and locals not having any space to actually be able to live anymore because these have been made into global spaces. Where do you see, because this feels like a movement that's going across the world, right? I don't want to call it cyclical, it's still linear,
Yeah, it's very linear.
right? It's still linear. We haven't reached that cyclical stage. Where do you see the Bahamas in that sort of progression that is happening globally? And we can have a discussion about how transnational that is, right? And how supranational blocks are affecting these as well.
Mm-hmm.
But where do you see the Bahamas in that movement that is happening transnationally?
So I think we are kind of with London in that London emptied out many of its upper echelon neighborhoods by virtue of Russians and other oligarchs coming in and buying up multiple properties. So what happened at the same time was that the very wealthy English people could not compete with the oligarchs. And so the oligarchs bought 2, 3, 4 houses and gutted the interior, but they had to leave the exteriors. And Anna Minton works on this within that context. So they create these massive buildings that you do not know is one house, but have pools inside. They go down 4 or 5 floors into the ground, but nobody lives there. So what we have done here in this sophisticated island living is created a space where there is nobody. So we depopulate entire islands to populate them with people who will never come or come for 2 weeks a year. So we're like right behind London in that regard, because I think this process started when the Soviet Union dissolved. Yeah, especially when there was a huge move in the Caribbean of Russians coming in and taking over casinos and operating casinos like in Belize and in other places. And they were bringing money out and investing to secure their wealth outside of the what was then Soviet Union.
Also, one connection that is obviously there is that many of the spaces that you're talking about that have been newly built have broken almost every environmental law. And if you pass them at night, not one light is on. And so no one is staying there. And if these buildings are ravaged during a storm, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Because there's minimal deaths, but also people are getting insurance, which is the important reason
Right.
it was invested in the first place.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Dr. Bennett, before you respond, we are over time, but I'm going to give it another 5 minutes or so. So we have 2 more questions.
Okay. I apologize,
Please,
that's my fault.
No, please do respond though.
I think while you were talking, I was thinking about the disaster risk that it was in 2016, 17, that act or something that came.
After Dorian.
Yeah, after Dorian, where
Yeah.
where so you were talking about that came to mind. And then when Dr. Zico was talking about it's linear, I don't know, for me it's cyclical. And the reason why I say this is because remember in slavery the whole aim was not for the enslaved to have access to land, right? I think that at a certain point the land fell into the hand of the majority of the enslaved people by most of the enslavers dying out or leaving it to their slave drivers or their descendants, whom were in effect mixed raced, which means that we've the now natives in the early 1900s, they would have had access to land, and we see the development, in my opinion, from my studies, when Paul Adderley, when who it is that went off to school in London, Paul Adderley, A.F. Adderley, all of those, and then you come all the way down to Linden, you see Randall Fox, or Cecil Wallace Whitfield, that access to the land is apparent because it switched hands, and now we're going back to this new kind of in class that is not there, that you keep talking with the hyper realization. I think that for me that's cyclical, because this is the spurn of the transatlantic slave trade morphing into, this is another iteration of something that we have to keep watching. And then I want to talk, I guess you could respond to the idea of placelessness, right? Because you talk about place, but I've been looking or studying placelessness in the context of what that means for queer Bahamians, and how all Bahamians experience that placelessness because there's no attachment to the space itself. So yeah.
So one of the challenges that most Bahamians will have is that we have no real access to information, because the Freedom of Information Act does not work, except especially when the whomever feels that it is a nuisance. Was it nuisance? The language of the act. And who decides if something is unreasonable or a nuisance? If it's a vexing request. So the other thing is the case law. The case law is indicating to us that those old colonial families are coming back, or people who are trying to empower themselves through those land dispositions or dispossessions, are trying to use that colonial language and the case law to own colonial land. So the lands that were given to friends of the crown back in the day continue to be owned by those friends of the crown, except their descendants. They didn't leave. They may have gone away, but they never gave up their right to own that land. And so they can come back and reclaim that in any way they wish. And another person who owned massive amounts of land on New Providence was Harry Oakes. But we don't ever think of it that way because he did so many wonderful things. Yes, I'm leaving. So the challenge is that the case law is hidden behind Hansard. Hansard is not a publicly available document, except if you can find a particular case and get the Hansard notes through the case, then some of it becomes public. The Privy Council actually does a lot of helpful stuff when it comes to the way they ventilate. I know you don't say that in English, sorry. They try the cases and the decisions they take and the decisions they write. Like in the US now, the Supreme Court is not writing decisions. But in the Privy Council, I don't know that the Privy Council has stopped writing decisions. So their reasoning, even if there's a dissent, is actually really helpful to looking at what is happening. But that's Eugene Depuge Law School. And seeing as the university has become a very undemocratic place, because I blame Olivia for that they refuse to give you the access to do the work they're telling you must do. So that's how of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was really interesting. And again, as we find pockets of time throughout the rest of today and tomorrow, I hope to see all these conversations continue to grow and blossom. And we'll solve one problem, right?
Hopefully, yeah, one problem. But remember that citizenship is always a challenge because the non-place is a real place. All airports have become non-places. The casino is a non-place because it has no identity. It does not resemble anything to do with the Bahamas. And for me, I'm looking at Ralph's non-place as a place of placelessness. And so, yeah.